So the Ismailis are part of the Shia branch of Islam. So just to provide some context, there are two major branches of Islam. One are the Sunni Muslims and the other are the Shia Muslims. Within the Sunni Muslims, there are, of course, several further branches, and within the Shia Muslims, there are further branches. And the Ismailis are part of the Shia Muslims, Shia Muslims. And they are the second largest of the Shia Muslim communities in the world today. Their numbers on their official website are between 15 to 25 million, and they are spread all across most parts of the world. Traditionally, they start off in, of course, Arabia, and then they spread into all the lands that the Muslims had occupied across the centuries. But today you have several Ismailis, Ismaili communities living in many parts of North America, Europe, etc. So they are very spread out. And within the Ismaili Shia, there are further branches. So there are those who are called the Nizari Ismailis, and then there are those who are called the Mustali Ismailis, who are today known also by names like Bohras, Suleimanis, etc. And the Nizari Ismailis are called Nizari Ismailis generally, and they believe that their rightful guide, their Imam, is His Highness the Aga Khan. And for them, he is the 49th direct descendant of the Prophet. So they follow his guidance in terms of their belief. There were several different Shi'i sort of communities and principalities, but because once the Abbasids rise to power in 750 CE, they come to power on the claim that they were the rightful descendants of the Prophet, and therefore restoring the rights of the Prophet's family. So that's how they come to power. Once they come to power in 750 CE, they're very wary, if you like, of other Shia groups whom they persecute because they see them as direct competitors. Because the Shia claim is that their imams, their guides, are the direct descendants of the Prophet. So when the Abbasids make the claim that their rulers are the direct descendants of the Prophet, you can imagine that there is a clash there of interests. So the Shia are then very heavily persecuted and tend to go underground for a while when the Abbasids are actually ruling from 750. And so it's interesting that within the Ismaili branch of the Shia, for example, there is a 150-year period which is called within the communal sort of memory as the Dor al-Satr, the period of concealment, when the names and whereabouts of their imams are actually kept deliberately hidden and camouflaged. So the movement goes underground. And it is in 909 CE, 150 years or so after all of these other events happen, so a century and a half after, where you then get this emergence of the first Fatimid Imam, who then Fatimid Caliph, who also claims, of course, to be the Imam. So he is the first within the Shia Ismaili line, the first ruler who publicly claims authority, both secular as well as religious, if you like. So he declares himself as the caliph over the entire Muslim world, while also claiming to be the Ismaili Shia Imam. And that happens in present-day Tunisia in 909 CE. Now, before this, there are several small principalities which are Shia influence. So you have So one of the three major branches of the Shia today, so the if I can just go back a little, there are three main Shia branches today. There are the so-called Itna Asharis, or Twelvers. There are the Zaydis, and there are the Ismailis. Right? So there are these three. There were many others, of course, along the way, but these are broadly the main ones today. And from the Zaydi Shia, you had small states established in North Africa, for example, in Morocco, with their capital at Fez. They were called the Idrisids, and they claimed descent again from the family of the Prophet. They also had a principality in the Caspian region of the Muslim world, in present-day Iran. So there were these small Zaydi Shia states already, but they were sort of spread out and far away from the center of political power, which was, of course, in Baghdad at the time, because that was the Abbasid capital. So the Fatimids claim that they are descendants from, as I said, from the Prophet Muhammad through his progeny of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet. So the Prophet had two grandsons, Hassan and Hussein. And the Fatimids claim lineage through Hussein and his family, his lineage, his descent. And they claim that the imamate for them, or the leadership for them, continued to the line of Hussein to Jafar as-Sadiq, who was around at the time of the Abbasids and who was the last Shia imam that was publicly known, and that line then continued while being camouflaged, while being protected from public attention because of the severe Abbasid persecution, that they belonged to that line. And the successor of Jafar as-Sadiq that they followed was called Ismail, which is why they call themselves the Ismailis. The Abbasid Empire by this time had really spread far and wide, and North Africa was nominally under Abbasid rule in that they were appointing governors in that region, but this was a nominal kind of allegiance. So the family that was ruling on behalf of the Abbasids, that dynasty came to be known as the Aghlabids. Right? So when the Fatimids first arrive in North Africa, they have to, and they encounter the Aghlabids. They have to fight the Aghlabids, and actually the Aghlabids then finally, leave because they're defeated, and the Fatimids take over. So it's a takeover from the Aghlabids for the Fatimids to position themselves and to rule in North Africa. So it's interesting because the Fatimids use what is called the da'wah, which is a proselytizing mission, if you like, to rally their cause, rally people to their cause. And it is some of those da'is who arrive in North Africa before the Fatimid Imam Caliph, the first Fatimid Imam Caliph Abdullah al-Mahdi arrives, and galvanize this support locally. And they are the ones who raise the armies and defeat the Aghlabids. And it takes about maybe a decade and a half to really establish political authority in the region. And once that is done, that's when the first Fatimid Imam Caliph is invited then to come and to declare his authority publicly. So in Egypt, you had another dynasty. They were called the Tulunids, and after them came the Ikhshidids. They too were ruling on behalf of the Abbasids. Again, same sort of arrangement. And when the Fatimids come, so the Fatimids start out in North Africa, in Tunisia. They reign there for 60 years. They established their rule by snuffing out the Aghlabids from power. And after 60 years of their rule in Tunisia and Algeria and that whole region, the southern Mediterranean, they gradually spread their influence and eventually they established themselves in Egypt in 969. And when they established themselves in Egypt, that's when they get rid of the nominal dynasty that was ruling on behalf of the Abbasids, and they were called the Ikhshidids. So they are then, pushed out, and the Fatimids take over in Egypt. It is something that the Fatimids particularly master, I think, because they start off in North Africa like that. And Egypt is even more interesting because by the time they come to Egypt, they were extremely powerful because they had come into the Mediterranean region when there was a greater flow of trade into the Mediterranean anyway. So they come with at the cusp of that movement and really benefit from it economically. And they become economically very powerful and therefore militarily so as well, of course. And they build a very powerful navy that they then use to navigate the Mediterranean. And they get a lot of taxes and income from providing protection across the Mediterranean to other principalities as well in the region. And so what that does is by the time they come to Egypt, they are extremely powerful and affluent, and they bring an army, we are told, from North Africa, from Ifriqiya, what was called Ifriqiya at the time, which is Tunisia today in eastern Algeria. They bring this army that marches along the southern Mediterranean coast, which is also accompanied by their own naval force, which we are told was so large that it took 7 days for the army to cross from Giza into Egypt. And historians give us numbers like 100,000 soldiers. Now that doesn't mean literally 100,000, which obviously means lots and lots. It's a very large army, very well equipped. Yet there are only minor skirmishes that actually happen in Egypt itself. Because exactly as you said, the dawah and the diplomacy have already laid the foundations. So we know, for example, we have some really interesting material culture that gives us insights. So we know that 15 years before the Fatimids actually arrive in Egypt, coins were minted in the name of the reigning Fatimid Caliphate at the time in Egypt, 15 years before they arrived. There were banners that were made available again in his name that were unfurled around, So you can see that they had these, they'd already worked out treaties and agreements with all the key stakeholders in Egypt before they arrive. So therefore, their arrival into Egypt, although is marked by this very powerful military force, it's much more ceremonial in reality because, a lot of this negotiations had already been successfully secured. So just to set the context then, when the Fatimids arrive in the Mediterranean, there were already 3 other major empires in the region. You had the Umayyads, who were ruling out of Andalusia, which is present-day Spain and Portugal. So they already were rulers there, and they had been there since 755 CE. So again, 150 years before the Fatimids arrive. You had the Byzantine Empire with its capital at Constantinople, what comes to be called the Eastern Christian Empire. So that was based there. And you also had the Abbasids, who had come to power in 750 with their capital at Baghdad. So when the Fatimids entered the political scene, there are these 3 major other empires in the region. And so, of course, as you rightly said, there is a lot of interaction, both political as well as and military as well as diplomatic, between these various empires. And what the Fatimids do is that they as I said, build a very strong and powerful navy, which then allows them to patrol the southern Mediterranean, which means that when the Byzantine navy tries to further its interests in the Mediterranean, there is then a pushback by the Fatimid naval forces. So you have these naval encounters between the Byzantines and the Fatimids, and between the Umayyads of Spain and the Fatimids as well, while they are still in Ifriqiya, while they are still in Tunisia. So they've honed those skills. And then when they arrive in Egypt, they now come with all of that experience and expertise, and they extend their rule through Egypt into the Red Sea. And so then, we have accounts of how the Red Sea at the time had become very mired with a lot of silt and other stuff. So they actually spend a lot of time clearing out these rubbish, and there were a lot of marauders and a lot of brigands around the Red Sea. So they clear out all of that, and the Red Sea then opens up for navigation into the Indian Ocean. So you can see that the Fatimid spread is not just political, it's and geographical, but it also means that they become extremely versatile in terms of trade right through the Mediterranean, into the Red Sea, and further into the Indian Ocean. And all of this means that, of course, the other empires are very jittery, and the Fatimid success is at their expense, clearly. And Syria is where they really are at loggerheads, because how history repeats itself, because Syria was the buffer between the Byzantines, who wanted to keep control of Aleppo as a security sort of border for them, for their own empire. Syria was also of great interest to the Abbasids because, of course, it neighbored their lands, and they wanted to again make sure that it was that it remained a buffer that was favorable to them. With the Fatimid arrival in Egypt, Syria was the natural place where they could be attacked from. So they are interested in securing their border in Egypt, but also extending their interests into Syria, again, because of the land routes through Syria as well, right? So there are major battles that happen between Byzantine forces, Abbasid forces, and the Fatimids in Syria. It's a constant maelstrom, if you like. There's constant, sort of fighting going over in that region, depending on whichever of these three powers is more powerful, and therefore exerts greater military pressure in that region. So yes, the Abbasids are extremely concerned. They are more than concerned. Their interests, not just their political interests, but their economic interests, are also directly encroached with the arrival of the Fatimids. And it's very interesting, if I made an example here, because so, for example, we know that the Abbasids were the only caliphs who publicly declared themselves as the caliphs over the entire Islamic world at the time. With the arrival of the Fatimids, they also make the claim that they are the rightful caliphs over the Islamic world. 20 years after the Fatimids now declare their caliphate, the Umayyads of Spain declare that they too are caliphs. So you now have three caliphates, Muslim caliphates, at the same time, all claiming supremacy over the entire Muslim world. And what's fascinating is that Mecca and Medina, which are seen as the two holiest cities of the Muslim world even today, from the pulpits of Mecca and Medina in the Friday prayer, the Abbasid Caliph is replaced with the Fatimid Caliph. So for the next 100 years after the Fatimids arrive in Egypt from 969, for the next 100 years, it is the Fatimids who are then declared as the rightful caliphs from over the entire Islamic world, from Mecca and Medina. And the covering of the Kaaba is sent from the Fatimids. Grain to the Hijaz, that whole region, is sent by the Fatimids. So you can imagine that even from a symbolic point of view, the Fatimids really established their hegemony in many ways across this whole region at the time. Egypt, one of the earliest cradles of human civilization, right? There have been, several civilizations that have, flourished in Egypt, of course. And it's interesting that, however, that although that was the case, you find that under Muslim rule, up until that point, Egypt had always been a economically lucrative province, but never the capital, like, for example, when Prophet Muhammad first establishes his authority from Mecca into Medina, etc., of course it was Arabia for that time. Then when the Umayyads come to power in 661 CE, they choose Damascus as their capital. And so Syria becomes that, hub. When the Abbasids come to power, they choose Baghdad. So Iraq becomes then clearly that hub. And so Egypt had always remained a province that was economically very rich. It was a very rich agrarian, of course, source of grain and all sorts of other staples that the Islamic world needed, and therefore an excellent source of tax and revenue as well for the capital. But it was never a capital in itself. It was never the seat of the caliphate. Under the Fatimids, it becomes the seat of the caliphate for the first time, as they proclaim, since pharaonic times, since the time of the pharaohs, right? So it really comes into its own. And because of that, it therefore is able to extend its influence. So we know, let me give you a couple of examples. We know that once the Fatimids established themselves in Egypt, they engage in trade across the Indian Ocean. So right across the East African coast, for example, they've found gold coins, dinars as they are called, Fatimid dinars, which have been found, from the sea, buried obviously along, over the centuries. But also we know that in Egypt, rock crystal was a very expensive medium from which they crafted beautiful objects. And under the Fatimids, this crafting of rock crystals into beautiful objects became a world-renowned specialty, if you like. But they get the rock crystal from Madagascar, and it is brought on boats from across the Indian Ocean to Egypt, where artisans from Syria, Iraq, parts of the Byzantine world all come together to then create these beautiful, jugs and other objects. And it's fascinating that long after the Fatimids are gone, we actually find these rock crystal objects as part of church reliquaries in Italy, in Sicily, and in many other parts of the world, which are then further embellished with gold, etc., and in which the reliquaries of the saints and others are kept as part of the church, treasures. So you can see the kind of influence that the Fatimids have that then transcends simply their actual areas of rule into far greater lands, and long after they themselves are no more sort of, in the ruling seat. One other example, we know that there are these beautiful carved doors that you find as part of the architecture and art of the Fatimids. But we now know that these were actually crafted in Gujarat, in India, and again brought through the Indian Ocean. There is a fascinating work called Lost Maps of the Caliphs, which actually is based on a manuscript that was discovered in Oxford University. Scholars worked on it, which is from an 11th century cartographer that actually provides these vivid descriptions of Fatimid traders involved in trade all the way to China, through the land route as well as through the sea routes. And it opens our eyes to what the world looked like, which was very different, of course, to how we think about it geographically. And if I may just give you one more example, Sicily was absolutely an integral part of the Fatimids in North Africa, in Ifriqiya. And so you find that if you today want to see the best preserved Fatimid art forms, it is actually in Palermo, in the Cappella Palatina, because the Norman rulers who came after, who were Christian, of course, and who came after the Fatimids had left from North Africa, actually had artisans come from Fatimid Egypt to build this church and beautify it, to make it exquisitely beautiful. And so the ceiling that is still preserved. And so you can go and see the most beautiful, as I say, surviving pieces of Fatimid art actually in Palermo, in Sicily. And, we think of Sicily as Europe today. And of course, we think of Tunisia as North Africa. And these are two very different geographical regions. But in fact, at that time, there was far more interaction. Again, we know that traders from Genoa and Pisa and all these Italian states were regularly trading with the Egyptians across the Mediterranean. So while there were these four empires and they had very clear ambitions and aspirations politically and militarily, there was a lot of intellectual, cultural, social movement of people. And so the fashions of the day, the foods of the day, the delicacies. So we know that a lot of these actually crossed borders. So goods and peoples and ideas were widely permeating and interacting across that whole world at the time. Up until the first 4 centuries of Muslim rule, so up until the 10th, even 11th century, the Muslim world, the Islamic world generally, was very open to ideas, to influences. And one of the ways that we know that is the way that sayings of the Prophet Muhammad are in circulation. So, for example, go unto China to seek knowledge. Now, from Mecca and Medina, China was the furthest they knew and the most different to what they were in Arabia, right? In terms of people, customs, cultures, knowledge, societies, all of that. The ink of the scholar is greater than the sword of the martyr. Learn from cradle to grave. These are all sayings attributed to Prophet Muhammad. So this idea of learning from the world around you, interestingly, the word in the Quran for the verses of the Quran are called ayats. Ayat literally means a sign, but then nature is called a sign of God too. So, looking at nature, learning from the world around you, all this was seen as part of this idea of learning about, the world and the creation, etc. So that attitude meant that even under the Abbasids, you had this place called Bayt al-Hikmah that was established by al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun, where you now find that scholars from the Persian tradition, from the Syriac tradition, from the Indian tradition are all brought together to share that corpus of knowledge, which is then translated into Arabic. Scholars well versed in Arabic work on that, and that whole corpus of knowledge is then filtered, if you like, or permeated through the Muslim world from Baghdad into Cairo, from Cairo into Cordoba, and into then the Western world. So today, when we talk about the Greek heritage that we have as part of the Western heritage, it comes to us through this whole centuries of Muslim influence and their input, if you like. And so in that sense, it's part of the human heritage. There isn't, I don't think one could ever say it's a copyright of one culture or one region, because that's the way human beings are, aren't they? If they're allowed to sort of, learn in that way and embrace knowledge. To your point about what happens in Egypt itself, you see, Egypt, as I said already earlier, because it had been a land of civilization for so long and so many different dynasties and rulers and empires had been in Egypt long before the Muslims came. Just before the Muslims come into Egypt, it was actually under Byzantine rule, both Egypt and Syria. And so the indigenous population of Egypt, when the Fatimids first arrived, was still predominantly Copt Christian. And it is only as the Fatimids arrive in Egypt that Egypt gradually then becomes majority Muslim. So you have a very strong, very well-established Coptic Christian population. You had Melkite Christians, you had Nestorian Christians, you had several denominations of Jewish communities who were already long settled there before the Muslims had arrived in the region. And what the Fatimids do is something very interesting, because they use the concept of what Prophet Muhammad uses when he comes to Medina, because when Prophet Muhammad comes to Medina in 610, Medina is not majority Muslim, of course. You have, several Christian communities, you have several Jewish communities, you have people who are, worshipping idols, so there were all kinds of people in Medina. And he issues what was called the Charter of Medina, or what came to be called the Charter of Medina. And within that, he uses a Quranic concept called Dhimma, 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 which literally means a canopy of protection. And so what Prophet Muhammad says is that anyone who lives in Medina is under his canopy of protection, whether they are Jewish, whether they are Christian, whether they are Muslim, whether they are idolater, believe in idolatry, it didn't matter, right? And the Fatimids seem to take on that, they actually take on that concept. And so they offer this guarantee of safety of people's lives and livelihoods, etc., to everyone who is part of Egypt at the time, regardless of what religious denomination they come from. And the fact that they are Shia and Ismaili and a minority, therefore, within the broader Muslim fold, that seems to be something that they use to their advantage, because they say, well, those who are Ismailis can continue to be so and can follow the religious guidance of their Imam, who is now the ruler of the state. Those who are Sunni Muslims can continue to follow as per their own denomination of Sunni Islam, but the state provides that safety. So the state provides for the upkeep of all religious spaces of worship, whichever denomination of Islam they are from. The state provides safety and security of people in terms of getting justice, for example. So they allow for multiple systems of justice, of administration, etc., to their populace. But as far as public law goes, as far as state law goes, then that is the Fatimid law that they apply. And what that allows them to do is that they are able to draw from a much wider pool of expertise. So in their administration, you could have a Christian chief minister. You could have a Jewish finance minister. It didn't matter. It didn't matter what religious denomination you were, so long as you were able to serve the state. That meant that these communities saw themselves reflected in the state, and therefore participated, they were invested in their rule. And it's very interesting because the Fatimids are the only Shia rulers who have ever ruled over Egypt before their time and to today. Egypt has always remained by and large Sunni. But the Fatimids rule over Egypt for almost 2 centuries, just over 2 centuries. And by and large, their rule is seen as peaceful and prosperous. But it is these kinds of mechanisms that allow them, and of course the economic prosperity as well, which means that people generally feel more settled and more secure. Now, was it a land of milk and honey? Of course it wasn't. Like any other agrarian environment, as they say, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. So when the Nile rose enough, and it inundated the lands with, silt and soil, and then there was prosperity. But there were several years when the Nile didn't rise to the level required, or it flooded the lands. In both those cases, you then had crops failing, famine and pestilence and illness and disease. And so there were those kinds of challenges that the Fatimids also had to cope with. One of the things they introduce is that they build storehouses where grain is kept. And so when these lean years happened to come by, they were then able to draw from those storehouses so that people could, to the level possible, be given basic sustenance. Unlike before, where what used to happen is that greedy merchants would, of course, hoard the grain, and when these lean years came by, they would then sell this, at exorbitant prices, etc. So you find that there are several ways in which the Fatimids find ways of enabling the people, by and large, to live peacefully. Of course, there are several conflicts that happen during their period. One of the things that weakens them the most is when there are internal fissures, when there are conflicts within the Fatimid court regarding succession of the next Imam Caliph. That's one of the major weak points that they suffer as well. Cairo, interestingly, was built by the Fatimids. There was no such city as Cairo. And even today, when you go to Cairo, of course, its Arabic name is Al-Qahira Al-Muiziyah, the victorious city of Al-Muiz. Al-Muiz was the 4th Fatimid Imam Caliph, and it was in his time that Egypt came under Fatimid rule. Right? And so in Cairo, you find that there are several such enterprises. So one of the fascinating things that you find is that the Fatimid Imam Caliphs themselves seem to have been very interested in learning and knowledge. And so they had these libraries in their palaces, which was supposed to be the wonders of the world of their time, in that, you have these descriptions about the library and what it contained and how several of these Imam Caliphs, would visit, during their rule and, get completely immersed in learning. And there's one fascinating example of Al-Muizz himself, for example, where he, starts to, leaf through a particular book and draws, it reminds him of something else he had read. And the librarian tries to bring those books out to him, but he knows there's something further. So he goes into the palace library and then, gets so immersed in reading, these different works that the whole night passes like that. And in the morning, he realizes only because he's got this severe pain in his legs because he's standing all night. So you have these interesting anecdotes about the Imam Caliphs themselves. We are told that Al-Muizz again knew several languages, not just Islamic languages, but, Berber and, Syriac and all sorts. So it's very interesting that seems to be, they themselves seem to be very interested and immersed in this, culture of knowledge and learning. It's also interesting that you find that when the Fatimids first arrive in Egypt, they lay the foundations of the city, of course, the palace, and the first mosque that is built, which is called the Al-Azhar Mosque, which is, of course, even today a bastion of Muslim learning across the Islamic world. But within a few years of this establishment, we find that the Fatimid Imam Caliphs have 35 scholars who are housed next to the Azhar, and their role is to teach in between prayer times at the Azhar. So the Azhar serves as a center of learning as well as religious congregation very early on. Then you find that in 1011, they established this place called the Dar al-Hikmah or the Beit al-Hikmah. And that is a place where in the time of the sixth Fatimid Imam Caliph called al-Hakim bi Amrillah, you have this whole center established where anyone from any background can come into this place and copy from very precious manuscripts. Scholars were housed there to teach about all the, what were called the natural sciences. So from philosophy to grammar to medicine to, linguistics, whatever it may be. And these were all subjects taught at this place. People could come and visit. The state provided for the upkeep of the place and for writing materials, etc. And while we take this kind of a facility very much for granted today, this was a complete paradigm shift at the time, because as we know, paper was only just being used by that point. And prior to paper being available, the writing materials themselves were extremely expensive, whether it was papyrus or whether it was leather or whatever else it might have been. And so scholars would have to go to learn at the feet of the master, so to speak, wherever the master was. And most people couldn't afford to be just scholars because you had to, it wouldn't pay for your livelihood. Whereas creating this kind of a place where, again, we know that copies of all the manuscripts that were in the Fatimid Palace Library were placed in this Dar al-Hikmah, in this, and so people could come and now access this material. And that kind of access that was enabled and opened up really made Cairo part of the knowledge society of their time. There are some fascinating things. And, within all this, I'm glad you said men and women, because, of course, we know that there were some very powerful women at this time. There is a lady called Sayyida Arwa, again, on whom we have a lot of material. There is somebody called Sitt al-Mulk, who really sort of led the empire, while her brother was quite young and still, under her tutelage. So there are several such figures. There is this extremely well-known scientist called Ibn al-Haytham, to whom we owe the origins of the science of optics, for example. There was a famous engineer called Ibn Yunus, who was one of the earliest people whom we know about, who thought of damming, creating a dam on the Nile, for example. So you have several such figures and many, many stories. Fatimid studies per se is now become it's a very in vogue subject. There seem to be lots of people who are very interested. So you're getting some fascinating PhD theses, master's works, Fatimid culture and material culture, and art and architecture. You have lots of new stuff coming out around that. It's a really up and growing area of research. And gradually, what's also very interesting for someone like me is that we are finally able to start putting things together as part of the bigger jigsaw of that time. So rather than just seeing the Fatimids as this Ismaili Shia from a religious angle only and a bubble, therefore, in North Africa or in Egypt, we are now sort of seeing how do they map out as part of this very vibrant 10th, 12th century Mediterranean world, which really was a very, very culturally, intellectually, socially, politically lively period, a very dynamic period of the world at large, I would say. So it's very interesting because when you go to a place like Tunisia or to Cairo, to Egypt, you of course find a lot of architecture that still exists. So in Tunisia, you have a city on the southern coast called Mahdia. It's Mahdia. It still exists as a city. It was built by the first Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Mahdi after he had established Hilf in North Africa. So back to 915, 916 CE. It's fascinating because the city walls still exist. You still can go to that place. The city gates are still there. They are massive. And you walk through those city gates and you walk through the streets that are named after some of these key figures in during that period. And you get to see where their palace was. You get to see the mosque that they had built, which has been rebuilt several times, but it's in the same space. There is a museum there where you see some fascinating artifacts, coins and marble pieces and all sorts, decorations from the palaces, etc. Beautiful mosaics. So you have that kind of architecture that still survives. Similarly, in Cairo has 3 city gates that were originally built in Fatimid times that still exist to this day. They have several other buildings that are from that period, or at least parts of it are from that period. The main thoroughfare in downtown Cairo, which is what was the Fatimid city hub, still exists. Of course, it has been rebuilt several times, but you can actually walk along the thoroughfare. It's still called the street of Al-Mu'is, Lidinallah. So you find that architecturally, there is a lot that still exists. And in terms of material culture, there are these tiraz pieces that are fascinating cloth pieces from linen and silk and brocade that were commissioned in the royal court and which were then given as gifts. We've got pieces of those that have survived. So you get a lot of that stuff. In terms of people, what's fascinating is that while the Fatimid dynasty itself comes to an end in Egypt, with the split from within the Fatimid house, you have the Nizaris who established themselves after this in 1094 in Iran and in Syria. And they, of course, continue to this day. So you have living communities that see themselves as successors to the Fatimids. And you have the Musta'ali communities who also, with the split that happens in Egypt within the Fatimid house, then move to Yemen, and then from Yemen to India, and who also are around today. And so you have these two communities, living communities, who look back to this past as their heritage, as their continuity of their history and heritage. You have these communities that are also, living, as it were, and carry on and draw from this history and this heritage to this day. And so if you look at the way the Bohras, for example, build their places of learning and their places of worship, they will often replicate these Fatimid buildings architecturally, because for them this is part of their living culture and tradition and heritage. From my point of view, the one thing that I think remains to be done and we can all benefit from is to see the interconnectedness of these empires at the time, and therefore the shared human heritage that really is very, very engaging for that time, but I think has a lot to teach us today about how we can be much more understanding of what connects us as cultures and peoples, rather than what I think divides us often. And I think that's a big, big lesson from my point of view. It's a big realization that in fact we are far, far more interconnected than we think, even within the Islamic world. So when we talk about the Shia and the Sunni, etc., you often hear about this in very polemical contexts sometimes. But in fact, there is a lot more that binds us, that connects us. And I think it's fascinating to see how people of over 1,000 years ago were able to do that so successfully.